Hello. In this video I want to take you through the Rhodes MK8 MIDI piano. We'll talk about what MIDI actually is and what it can be used for, and we'll talk about what the MK8 MIDI itself can do, what kinds of MIDI it can generate, and what you would actually use that for. We'll talk about the companion app that comes with it, so that you understand all of the various features and settings and what they exist for. And then we'll actually do some setups and we'll try the MK8 MIDI doing a couple of different things so that you can understand how to set it up and the kinds of things it can do. So first, what is MIDI? So MIDI is a type of control data and it's been around for a long time. And many synthesizers will have MIDI on them. And what MIDI actually is a type of musical control data. And so in a simple way, what's happening when I play a keyboard like a Rhodes MK8 MIDI is it's creating information that is the information of the performance. The notes I played, how hard I pressed them, how long I pressed them for, and things like the dials and other buttons will often generate MIDI. And if I send that to something else that knows what to do with that data, then I actually can control it from my keyboard. And this means that even though I'm using something like a Rhodes MK8 MIDI, which is making a particular sound, we might be hearing a completely different sound coming from another instrument. And so that means that this becomes like a master keyboard so that I can play something that's not a Rhodes, but use the same keyboard to do it. It also means that I could do interesting things like I could hybridize and create a audio blend of the actual sound that the Rhodes is making, while at the same time it's making a sound on a synthesizer too, and create this kind of hybrid combo of acoustic and electronic instrument that is neither one nor the other. The other thing that we can do with MIDI is obviously send it into a computer. And we could do that to do a similar sort of thing where the computer actually makes the sounds and responds to the keyboard. But it also allows us to record a performance, to play a Rhodes and not only capture its audio, but actually capture the notes that we played. And we might like to do that for reinforcement. That is, we use a virtual instrument and that data drives it. But we could also change the performance and trim notes and fix things, adjust how hard we pressed notes and whether we were late or early on certain notes, we could fine tune it and grab it. Or even completely invert and transform and mangle them. By generating this data and recording it into a computer, there's just loads you can do with it. And so if that's the sort of basics of MIDI, then the next question is, what sort of MIDI can this keyboard produce? So the MK8 MIDI can produce a bunch of different types of control information. When you play the keys, the first things it creates is called a note on and a note off message. That is, it records when you push the key and when you let go of the key. It can also record the velocity of every note. Velocity is the name of how hard you push the note when you push the note on. The other thing that it can record is called aftertouch. And in fact, actually one of the most significant things about the MK8 MIDI is that it creates polyphonic aftertouch. And so what aftertouch is when I push the key down, that was velocity, right? Once the key is fully depressed, if I push a bit harder, an additional type of data is generated. This is when aftertouch is generated. And again, the significant part of the MK8 MIDI is it's polyphonic. So if I play a chord, I can push one key or the other or combinations of them and generate an additional layer of per note information that I can do different things with using a synthesizer or a piece of software. So that's really one of the coolest things about it. Polyphonic aftertouch is not a new concept, but to have it in a keyboard like this is really quite significant. Another type of data it can generate is from the pedals. That's so when I push the sustain pedal down, that creates information that software and hardware can interpret. And then the final piece of the puzzle are the dials and buttons on the panel. When you turn many of the dials to do with the effects, and when you push the buttons, this also creates control information called CC data in the case of the knobs. And you can use these knobs and map them, depending on your software and hardware, possibly to anything. Most software synths have the ability for you to map physical MIDI controllers to do whatever you like. And in the case of the MK8 MIDI, this means that you've both got a really nice master keyboard that can generate polyphonic aftertouch, and also right at your fingertips, you've got a few well-placed controls that you could use to, for example, control maybe like one setting on a synth that's the thing you want to mess with for that patch. Or you could also, depending on the synth, create macro controllers where the one piece of MIDI information that you're sending in actually controls multiple things. That's dependent on the synth because the Rhodes itself will just create one MIDI CC. But it's worth thinking about. Depending on the software and the hardware you use, you might find you can actually create a really interesting set of controls for yourself and have them right next to the keyboard that you're playing. The MK8 is also able to create what are called keyboard splits. This is where you can virtually divide the keyboard into two and send half of the keyboard on one MIDI channel and the other half on another. And it doesn't have to be halves, it can be anywhere you like on the keyboard. And to quickly explain channels, the MIDI standard means that you can have 16 devices being controlled through one cable. And so in order to have something like a MK8 MIDI controller sound module, what I need to do is ensure that they are set to the same MIDI channel. We'll look at how we change the MIDI channel on the MK8 in a second, but on the synthesizer or piece of software, this will vary. But usually there's always somewhere in the menu where you can choose the MIDI channel, and it's just a case of having them on the same channel, and then they'll talk to each other. A very final point on MIDI is actually how you make those physical connections. How do we get MIDI into our thing? Well, there's two ways. The first is the more traditional way, which is using a wire. And the MIDI standard uses these things called MIDI DIN. That is to say a sort of round connector that has 5 pins, like a smiley face in the middle. And there is a MIDI out port on the Rhodes. You would connect the out of the Rhodes into the MIDI in port on the back of your physical device that you want the Rhodes to control. And it's that simple. What, though, do we do when we have, for example, a keyboard split and we want two things to be controlled from the one keyboard? Well, we've only got one out on the Rhodes. And so what we do is we go from the out of the Rhodes into the in of that device. And then that first device will need a MIDI through port. And you can go from the MIDI through of that device to the in of the final device. And then you set the final device to correspond to the MIDI channel that the other half of the split is set to. And not all keyboards do have a MIDI through, though many will. If you don't have one with the MIDI through, then there are such things as MIDI splitters, which are little passive or active devices that would let you copy the output of the Rhodes to multiple devices. And they can be super useful if you want to do MIDI splits, which you can do, and it's a nice thing to do. Obviously, the other type of connector is USB. There is a USB connector on the side of the Rhodes MK8, and we use this to both send and receive MIDI to the Rhodes MIDI brain, which we're going to do in a sec. And so if you want to use a Rhodes with a computer, that's really the easiest way of doing it. But bear in mind the physical 5-pin DIN version, because that's what you would do if you have hardware synths. So that's the sort of primer in MIDI, the kinds of things that we can make, and the basic kind of connections, how we have to make connections to make things respond. Let's now play with the app. We'll look at all of the settings so you understand how to use it. So let's now talk about the app. So on the computer, I've got the MK8 MIDI Control System app, And what this app lets you do is it lets you talk to the MIDI brain that's inside the Rhodes MK8 MIDI. And we can configure aspects about how the keyboard responds so that we can fine-tune its MIDI output to our liking. And whatever we change in the software gets stored automatically into the keyboard. So you can disconnect it and then the settings are retained. The first thing we need to do is obviously connect it so that the computer is talking to the Rhodes. And the way that is done is only via USB. So let's do that. Around the side of the Rhodes is a USB port. And all I need to do is take the right type of cable and plug it in so that one end is in the Rhodes and the other end is in your computer. Now, if we look on the app, when I connected the cable, MK8 MIDI 1.0 appeared in the MIDI input and output port. And this is telling me that it is talking to the Rhodes MIDI brain correctly. If you play any of the keys, on the little virtual keyboard here, you'll see that they start to come alive and respond as you press. And if we fully depress the keys and then push harder, we can see the polyphonic aftertouch in action. In fact, it is showing us how each note differs, so you can actually see the response in action. The main point is it just tells you that yes, you have made the connection correctly and the software is now talking to your Rhodes. So this is the app. I'll give you a bit of a sort of quick bird's eye overview and then we'll go through column by column and we'll talk about what all of these things are. The first thing is that we are looking at the control section here. If I click this button on the left under View, it's called Setup. And in Setup, there are some very occasional things you might like to do, such as checking the firmware of your brain inside the Rhodes and updating the firmware when firmwares are released. We can also do calibrations if we need to, but you shouldn't need to do those by default. But what is perhaps worth noting in here is factory restore. And if for any reason that you've been mucking around in the control section and are not happy with what you have done and perhaps have changed settings and can't remember what they were before, well, while there are some ways of coming in and resetting controls by opening these up and pushing default, we can reset the whole brain back to how it was if you go into Setup and hit Factory Restore. So if you get yourself in a pickle, that's how you can go in and just reset everything to how it was. And then you can go back and set it up exactly as you like it. Down here are two options of other things that we can display to help us see what's going on. The first one is called Monitor. If I move this all up here, this is really useful. It shows you what the Rhodes is actually kicking out in terms of MIDI. Earlier, I mentioned things like note on and note off, pressure and velocity, and that's what's being displayed here. And you can actually turn these things on or off. If you just want to look at pressure, for example, and examine what channel it's being sent on, what note it's being sent and the strength, this can be really useful. The most important use of all, perhaps, is when you come to wiggle the controls. Here, if I wiggle one of the dials, I can see that it's set to controller 22. That's the CC number that this part of the phaser dial sends on. And that's a really useful piece of information if I want to map this to control something else. Quite often on an app, you know, like a virtual synth, there'll be a way of saying MIDI learn and you can just twiddle the knob. But I think it's still very useful to be able to look and see what these knobs are sending on. Because one thing to say is that it is not possible to change the MIDI CCs or the kind of values that the various knobs and buttons send on. That's set. And in fact, there is a document that we'll link below, which is the kind of MIDI map, as it were. It's the MIDI configuration telling you exactly what MIDI CCs the knobs send on, exactly what information is sent, so that you've got a bit of a technical map if that's something that you need. Just know you can always push Monitor and get this extra information, see exactly what it's doing. This one here is Keyboard, and that literally just toggles the little visible keyboard on or off. If it's a distraction, you can just get it out of the way. But we'll leave it on. So I return to the controls menu, and let's go through these 3 columns. The first one is called MIDI device. And this is some basic kind of initial setup. Here is the MIDI input and output port. And the main use of this is being able to see, when we have this thing connected via USB, that we indeed see Mark 8 MIDI in these boxes. That tells us that we're talking to our Rhodes. If you've connected the Rhodes and you don't see it in these input and output ports, then you can push refresh ports. And what that does is it just asks the app to look again at what is plugged into the ports. So you can hit this to refresh this. The next thing is MIDI channel. And so we mentioned earlier that there are 16 MIDI channels in the standard. And we can choose any of the 16. And then if we choose this, say 7, well, it's MIDI channel 7 that the keyboard is now sending on. And if I connected a synthesizer through the MIDI DIN, then I would need to set that synthesizer to receive on channel 7. Otherwise, you wouldn't hear anything when you played the keys. So that's how you choose what MIDI channel it's sending on. The next thing is MIDI resolution. Now, this is a bit of a tricky one, but it refers to the resolution of the dials. When MIDI was first introduced back in the early 80s, there were only 127 different values that the dials swept through. When you have it at the bottom, it's 0. When you have it at the top, it's 127. And there's 127 steps in between. This is called 7-bit MIDI. And the reason for that is that it actually uses 7 bits of 1s and 0s, and 7 bits of 1s and 0s together make a total of 128 combinations from 0 to 127. What 14-bit MIDI is an improvement on the standard. That came out in 1991, and it basically doubles the amount of bits used, and it vastly increases the resolution of the knobs. This means that if you have a device or software that can receive 14-bit MIDI, then you'll get much finer control if you use it. The trick is that obviously hardware made before 1991 would not support 14-bit MIDI. And you might find that if you're trying to control something that's quite old, that you may be getting funky responses as you turn the dials. If that's the case, you can try switching it back to the old school 7-bit MIDI. You'll only have 127 steps, but that's still probably enough, and you may find that it responds correctly as a result. The point is, the keyboard supports both types, and you choose it here. CC transmit refers to the fact that when we turn these dials, we are sending CCs. Indeed, we can see that if we pull up our little monitor again and wiggle the dials, we can see that we're sending CCs on controller 9 in this instance. Now, if you are, for example, creating a hybrid instrument where you're playing the Rhodes keyboard and you are also playing the effects so that you can change the sound of the Rhodes, but at the same time, you are also sending MIDI, and that MIDI is playing a synthesizer, you might find that the dials you're turning, which are changing the internal voice, will be sending CCs to that synth and actually changing sound settings on the synth where you perhaps don't want them to change. And that's what CC transmit lets you fix. By going off, I then am not sending CCs when I turn the dial. So this means you can just use these knobs to control the Rhodes inbuilt effects and at the same time send MIDI, but not have that MIDI contain the wiggles of your dials. That's really useful when you're creating a kind of hybrid sound. So if you find that it's editing a synth and you don't want it to, then that's what you use CC transmit for. Turn it off. You can always turn it back on if you wish later. So that's MIDI device. The next thing is curves. And curves is where we change how the keyboard sends MIDI in response to how we play. We obviously can't change the physical feeling of the keyboard, but we can change how the keyboard interprets the pressure that we apply. The first one is velocity sensitivity. Velocity is the name for when you push a key down. That initial press is velocity. And in effect, it can be the volume of something, but of course we can map velocity in many soft synths and others to other values. And what sensitivity is doing is making it more sensitive so that we can push lighter and have a bigger response occur. We can go the opposite way and make it so that if we push hard, we get a softer response. And so this is completely personal. It's a way of changing how much velocity is being sent, depending on how you play the keyboard. And what you might like to do with all of these is connect the Rhodes to something, i.e. a synthesizer or a soft synth. And with this program open, you could fine-tune that response as you listen to what it is controlling. So velocity, in short, lets you play soft or hard and scale that down or up so that you get the sound you want from the thing you're controlling. Next to each of these is a little plus icon, and that's an extra hidden control. In the case of velocity, it's called velocity curve. What velocity curve is to imagine that the difference in strength between a very soft press and a very hard press is on a graph. And if we go all the way to 0, then that graph is what's called linear. That a medium press is exactly in the middle of the velocity scaling. But if you move the curve, what it's going to do is basically create a kind of bow shape in that graph. And so a middle strength press will actually be slightly lower down in a different position. And what this is here to let you do is further refine how you play the keyboard, depending on when you like to play hard and when you like to play soft. How is that curve kind of graphed out from the softest parts to the hardest parts? Well, that's what curve lets you adjust. And again, I would advise playing the Rhodes with something responding and getting a feel for whether it's scaled well for the hardest and softest ways that you play. And if you're not sure or you've wiggled it too much in one direction, you can always hit default and that will return it to its default position, which is 12. Remember, we can also go into setup and hit factory restore if we wish. So the next thing is pressure gain. And what pressure gain is similar to what we were doing with velocity, except it refers to the pressure, which is the name for once we've fully pressed the key. If we push harder, we see this extra color appear in each note, and that's pressure. And in this instance, polyphonic pressure. And what pressure gain is letting you do is to increase it so that if you push lightly, you will easily get to the top, like that. Whoop. And if you bring it right down, it reduces the sensitivity to 0, where it does nothing. But you can feel this out. And in fact, you can even see on the screen and get a sense for whether it's doing what you want. But that's what that's letting you do, is it's kind of scaling the pressure response so that you can push with a lighter touch and get more out of it. And if you have a very hard touch, it'll let you scale it back down. In the plus here are two things. One is called resolution. And what resolution is, in simplistic terms, is a kind of smoothing that is applied so that you get less jitters in the response. If you turn it up, things are choppier, but less wiggly. And if you turn it down, the resolution is more wiggly and precise. We can make very small jiggles and movements, and they are translated. But if you increase it, that resolution is reduced. Things are more steppy, but less wiggly. And then again, this is something that is personal preference. Depending on how you like to play it, you may like a different setting. And what black key offset is a global control for the scaling of just the black keys. And you may wish to change the black keys in a way that is different to the whites because they're in a different physical position. You may apply less pressure or more to them for any particular reason. And so you may wish them to have a slightly different response to the white keys. And indeed, actually, the default is -3. They are calibrated slightly differently. This allows you to basically vastly increase the response. A little touch will move them all the way to the top, or you can go in reverse, where you have to push incredibly hard for them to register a press. Black key offset lets you just change how the black keys are scaled for pressure. Now, keyboard split is how we can divide the keyboard into two zones, where we can therefore have two different sounds on two different MIDI channels being sent from one keyboard. And if you move the dial, you will see keys referenced in a little box. And if you let go, suddenly, it's a little subtle here, but there is a brown section on the left and a green section on the right. If I move that to the right, it shifts. The brown section is bigger now, the green section is smaller, and its change point is A4. That's this key here. Now, what this means in terms of MIDI channels is a question, because you'll note that there is only one MIDI channel here. Now, currently, the way that this is implemented is that the left brown channel is always going to be this MIDI channel that is in the MIDI channel box. And the green channel adjacent to it is always going to be the next MIDI channel up. That means that if the left is MIDI channel 1, then the right is MIDI channel 2, and so on and so forth. If the left is 9, the right is 10 that it is sent on. So if you want to control two synthesizers, you'd need to set them to adjacent MIDI channels that correspond first to this number and then to the next one along. And the one question is, what if you put it to MIDI channel 16? So that means that the left is on MIDI channel 16, and then in fact it wraps around, and therefore the right green channel will be on MIDI channel 1. If we push the plus, there's actually this nice little way that we can physically change the split point. You can push a key, say this one, C4, and it will immediately update and make the split wherever you pressed. And you can keep pressing and feel out intuitively where you want the split to be. You can also push middle C, and that will just make the split middle C. And you can also disable the split, which makes the whole keyboard zone brown. It makes the MIDI channel just be this one MIDI channel. Everything's being sent now on MIDI channel 1 for the whole keyboard. One little detail here is that if you have keyboard splits enabled, you might ask, what happens to the knobs? The knobs and the sustain and all these other things get sent equally on both channels. Both channels will get the same CC values that you're sending from the knobs, the buttons, and the sustain pedal. Of course, you can turn that off entirely if you go CC transmit to off. So let's go through and we'll disable that split. The final column is controls. And these ones are quite fun. What transpose is a way of transposing the MIDI output up by semitones, so that if you push C, it's sending on C. But if I go +1, it is in fact now sending C sharp. And in fact, I can see that. I'm pushing C, you'll have to believe me, but I am. And it's actually triggering the note above it, which is just, in short, a fun way of remapping the keyboard. You could play familiar scales and have them be shifted further up in the response that you get. And you could do some interesting things. If you shifted it up 5 semitones, then you could play notes on the Rhodes, and then the MIDI device that you were sending it to would be playing up a fifth It's interesting. You can have a play and explore it. It's a lot of fun. Below that is a similar idea, but octaves. What that's letting you do is shift the entire response of the keyboard up or down octaves. We can see here it is shifting what I am playing by 1 octave up. I'm playing C4, but it's triggering C5, and it goes even higher. And you can do the opposite and go down low. This is, of course, really useful if you're wanting to play something in a certain register, but hear a kind of bass register or a higher register from the thing that is being controlled by the Rhodes. The final two are sustain mode and pressure mode. What sustain mode is doing is this is a way of changing how the sustain pedal works. If I turn the monitor on, I have a sustain pedal connected. If I push the pedal, and I'm pushing it up and down, then we can see that a single value is being sent on and off, 127 or 0. But if I do sustain smooth, now if I partially depress the pedal, then this becomes an expression pedal, in fact. It's registering all of the in-between values that I'm generating by slowly moving my foot up and down. And this is creating a kind of much more detailed high resolution control. And I could use that, map it to something in a synthesizer perhaps, and it would be controlling some timbral quality of the synth. It's not just on or off if you don't want it to be. And finally, pressure mode is to say whether we turn pressure on or off. Literally, now if I push down, it does not send pressure anymore. Turn it on and it does send pressure. It's the same sort of thing as the CC transmit value, but it's there for pressure. If, for whatever reason, you'd like to turn it off so that your synth or whatever you've got this connected to, if you don't want it to respond to it, just turn it off. That's it. And again, I think it's worth just summing up by saying, if you connect the Rhodes to something that you want to control, then you can come through here. And with this program open, you can fine tune these responses until you like them. And you don't need to do anything to save them. Once you've made the value changes, they're immediately stored inside the keyboard. And you can take out the USB cable, power cycle the Rhodes if you wish, and it'll always remember those settings that you had it set to. So you don't need to do anything to save, just make the changes you want, and you're good. And finally, if you've made a mistake, or whatever reason you want to start again, go into Setup, hit Factory Restore, and it'll just reset all these controls to the default. Let's now actually have a little play. We'll connect something physically to the Rhodes and make some sounds. Okay. So using the MIDI DIN out, I've connected my Rhodes to my stack of keyboards. And the important thing is that I've got the channel set up on the app so that the channel that I'm sending on corresponds to the channel I want to hear on my synth. And I want to hear my Arturia Mini Freak up here, and it's set to MIDI channel 9. So indeed, in the app, I'm not using keyboard splits, and I've got it set to channel 9. And now when I play the keyboard, I hear the Arturia. Very nice. Now, when I push the keys, nothing happens. And that's because I haven't mapped aftertouch to do anything. And so in your synth, there will be a way that you can change the mapping. And in the case of the Mini Freak, it's possible to map aftertouch to really any parameter. I can also use velocity to control things like the strength of the filter. So if I play harder on the keys, the filter will change. And if I push, once the keys are fully pressed down, then that's aftertouch. And I get polyphonic aftertouch so that each note can be slightly different. So let me quickly set something up with Poly Aftertouch. Okay, so I just dug into the menus of my Mini Freak, changed a few parameters so that just Aftertouch will control a timbral parameter. And I'm finding I have to push quite hard to get the effect to come in. So I'm going to come into the app and I'm going to change the Aftertouch pressure gain. Boop. That's a bit much. Back it off and come in here, and I might increase the resolution. Do you hear there how I'm able to pick individual notes out? 1, 2, 3, 4. That's poly aftertouch in action. On a Mini Freak and on some other synthesizers that support it, it means that it's taking full advantage of this ability to have individual expression on each key. And to stress again, I'm using a subtle thing here, but that can really be anything that you map poly aftertouch to. Another really lovely one is vibrato. We can have it so that when I push a key, it'll create vibrato. Let's set that up. Lovely. Then, of course, what happens if we blend the Rhodes itself, all the sounds it's still making inside here, with that? Oh, interesting. Here we hear how this chorus knob is actually controlling a parameter in the Mini Freak. Now, of course, you remember that we can turn that off if we wish. We return to the software, we can turn off CC Transmit. Now, when I turn this, it just affects the chorus that's in the Rhodes. Tweaked it a little bit. Really nice, this hybridization. Yeah, it's so nice. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Because of course you can map velocity and aftertouch to control basically anything that your synth affords you the ability to map it to. And we also have these dials, which we can use to control things immediately, or we can disconnect so that we can control just the Rhodes' voice and then blend it with that synth. A really interesting thing that we can do is using USB, we can send MIDI into the Rhodes MK8 MIDI, and we can actually control a number of parameters that respond to MIDI. Now, not all of these knobs do send or receive MIDI. That's to say the envelope amount, the low, the gain, and the high don't send or receive MIDI. The drive knob over in the preamp section actually will send MIDI, but it doesn't respond to it. All the other knobs do, and with a special emphasis on the effects. And I'm soloing them here because I think there's a really interesting application of this. So we understand these send MIDI, but they'll also receive it. If you send MIDI CCs on the correct CC numbers, then you can alter the dials as if an invisible hand is turning them. And this means that you can sort of automate them so that they're sweeping and doing interesting creative effects. Like the chorus could go from slow to fast on a moment-to-moment basis. You could also, in effect, use this as a way of storing and recalling presets. That's to say, you could have a MIDI template in your DAW that is used as part of a performance, and by shifting to certain parts of that template, it would send the requisite MIDI to these dials and so immediately change the sound of your Rhodes. That would mean that when it was time to play a certain song, you would send this data into the Mark8 MIDI and suddenly the sound would change and reflect what you needed and had pre-prepared for that song. Let's now play with the computer. Now, I've got another little example for you of something a bit off the wall. I've got Ableton Live here running on the computer, and I'm running two Max for Live devices, which are MIDI event processors. And what this is going to let me do is reinterpret some of the signals the Rhodes creates and turn them into things that will wiggle the controls for us. That's right, we can use things like pressure, and I can have it so that the pressure actually moves the delay time for me. The way that I've done this is with two free devices. One's called Expression Control, and what that does, if I play this and push, if you can see, you would be able to see the little thing jumping up and down every time I push. And I can map that to anything. But what I've done is I've mapped it to this thing called CC-LFO. And what CC-LFO does is it creates LFO, slow-moving wiggles, which I could send in to control things like the delay time. But at the moment, I haven't got the wiggle enabled. Instead, I'm using it as a way of turning pressure into the delay time. And this is obviously quite weird and wibbly. What I might like to do is come in here and trim some of these ranges so that things aren't so extreme, and I can basically fine-tune the amount of the effect so that it stays within the, bounds of reason. Well, you're all obviously wonderful players. You'll have to excuse my playing, but I hope this illustrates an interesting point, which is that by using the computer as a sort of interpreter for MIDI, then you can both send MIDI from the keyboard into a computer, you can manipulate it and turn it into something else, and then you can throw it back into the Rhodes to control the effects. What we've done is we've created functionality that doesn't actually exist within the keyboard. And you can go much further with this, of course, because the computer can make all kinds of data and then add what you're doing with the keys to it and send it all back into the effects or what have you. You could also be effecting with computer effects the Rhodes and using pressure and velocity to affect the effects that are affecting the Rhodes. And one fun thing which I really should do here is turn up the rate control, because what CC-LFO really is meant to do is send wiggly controls into CCs. And if we do that, what's going to happen is the delay time is going to sweep and swoop as well as be controlled by our keys. it's got this like whoa, 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 whoa. That's CCLFO, which is adding wobbles at the same time as converting our pressure into control of delay time. This is just the tip of the wacky iceberg of all the things that are possible when you use a computer to reinterpret the data this creates and push it back into the machine or send it off to other things, such as plugins or other hardware synths. Okay, so here we are at the computer, and in short, I have the Rhodes connected via USB still, and this means that I can both control it with the app, but also I can send MIDI into the computer. You can see here with this little winking light that MIDI comes in. If I look here, I can choose the Mark 8 MIDI 1.0, and it's showing me that the MIDI is coming in happily. I'm currently hearing all the stuff coming off the mixer, so I'll turn it down. Now we don't hear anything, but we are getting data. We can see it from the bouncing activity indicators here. I can also see, here it is coming in on channel 9. I can also see the winking light up here that's showing me that there's activity. What I then do is load up some instruments and make sure that I've got this set as the input for them. And if I turn this up, we should hear something. Oh yes. Now, this is not just any random choice. I've picked the Archerius CS80V. And that's because this is a uniquely suitable plugin to try with this keyboard, because the original CS80 used a sort of similar kind of hammer action piano style keyboard, which had polyphonic aftertouch. And this is similar in many meaningful respects to the kind of keyboard that is in this. And so it's very nice being able to kind of play with the nice throw of this keyboard, but also bite harder into notes to hear that enhanced effect that is baked into this particular sound, for this is called aftertouch surprise. And we can indeed hear that when we play these notes down here, we can play a little solo above and bite into those notes, and they brighten in a way that these do not. That's polyphonic aftertouch in action. Now, what about keyboard splits? So if we open the app, which we can do at the same time that we have this software running, then we've been able to customize and fine-tune stuff as we go. But we can also create splits. So remember before, I can move this dial, and this will just create a split at whatever point I leave it. Or I can hit plus, and I can actually hit the key. Let's say I want that to be the place that the split occurs. We can hear that it's playing no matter which zone I play in, despite the fact that the zone changes there. And that is because I set this to all channels. If I instead say that I want this to be on channel 9, then I need to come over here and set this to channel 8. And do you remember the reason for that is because the left channel is going to be this one, 8, and it's always the one adjacent that will be the right split. So that means if I want the right to be 9, then I have to set the left to be 8. And in fact, I'm going to change that split point and make it slightly lower. Why not middle C? Now when I play down here, I don't hear anything because that's being sent on channel 8. So let's get another classic, which is the Mini Moog, or a virtual version of it. And let's set that to channel 8. Now this is a bit low, but what I could do is shift the octaves up. Do you hear? So that's useful because it shifted the register of this mini Moog to kind of where I want it to be along this octave. Let's have a bit of fun and put an arpeggiator on here to make it easy for someone who is not really a keyboardist, aka me, to play this. And then with the left hand, we can play a little arpeggio. And then of course, holding that down, with the right hand, we've got CS80. Of course, we can blend the other things that the Rhodes are triggering and layer things together. That is the actual innate voice of the Rhodes plus the mini freak as well. And mini freak. Here is creating like a lovely sort of drone for us. I hope this video has been useful to you, and I want to thank you for spending some time and learning more about how this works. If you have questions, please leave them below. And above all, we wish you happy music making. Thank you.